Nick, thanks for coming on Analog Dialogue.
Dude, thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So just before we get things rolling, for anyone watching who hasn't heard of what you do, could you describe your presence in the arts industry?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a bass player. I grew up in Los Angeles. I still live here, uh, and I've been a touring and session bass player for about the last. I'd say I started professionally. My first tour was when I was 19. So I kind of, and, the whenever you're in the arts, it's like the growing process of like when do you go from being like someone who's studying to being a professional is sort of blurry. But I kind of count my first national tour as kind of like the starting point. So I'm about to turn 30, so I've been doing it for about 11 years professionally.
Yeah.
And then I also write songs, and I have a few bands of my own that I write for, and sometimes I write for other people or will help arrange things or MD things for other people. But primarily, I'm a session and touring bass player.
Yeah. Great. So yeah, like the sort of stuff that at least I'm more familiar with and that I know you from is playing with like Pomplamoose
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah,
then in Scary Pockets here and there.
yeah.
Um, so and both of those are like massively collaborative projects.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're sort of always working with different musicians. So what role would you say collaboration plays in the way that you think about music?
I'd say it's a pretty big part of what I like about music. Like I definitely there's a lot of ways to make music right now, especially with a lot of the sort of like digital technology that exists. Like I have a lot of friends that they spend 100% of their time on laptops, like recontextualizing samples and building beats and
Mm,
more and doing sound design stuff. And I do a little bit of that, but primarily I sort of see myself as like a performer. And like a live musician. And a lot of the time, even when like the Pomplamoose tunes are a great example, like they get produced and mixed and there's sound design elements between what's happening.
mhm.
But at the end of the day, what's being captured is like a live performance. And part of what I really love about like the Pomplamoose and Scary Pocket sessions is a lot of that. Sometimes with Pomplamoose, there'll be more arrangement ideas up front, but a lot of the time we just show up and we figure out what we're going to do on the spot. And it almost feels like a Motown session where it's like, okay, we have
Yeah.
this song, like, how do we want to play it? And everyone's throwing out ideas at the same time, and you're trying to craft this thing in real time. And a lot of the time, we only have like 90 minutes to record the tune, and there's no arrangement. Uh, so it's sort of this like marathon thing where you're trying to recontextualize, especially because a lot of the songs are covers or like very clever
Yeah.
arrangements of covers that if you removed the vocal melody would just be totally separate compositions. So
Right.
like the line between arranging and composition is sort of blurry. Uh, and so a lot of the time we're just trying to figure out like how can we make this cool in a different way. And everybody in those sessions is so experienced playing with ensembles that we can kind of everyone has good arrangement ideas and we can kind of piece things together and everyone finds their spot really fast. And it's really fun because yeah, a lot of music isn't made like that anymore. That's how music always used to be made up until probably
Yeah.
until the introduction of samplers and stuff like that. Um, and I really enjoy that because you kind of capture this sort of like lightning in a bottle moment. Like something about recordings that's I think sort of interesting is they sort of exist in this weird space between like a commodity and like a time capsule. And the like the degree to which you produce something and add things kind of makes it like a distilled kind of product, not in like
Mm.
a capitalist way or anything, but like just like
No.
it's a thing. And then
Yeah.
uh, there's also a part of recording that's like we've captured this moment.
Of
And I
course.
think the
Yeah.
Scary Pockets Pomplamoose thing does a really good job of capturing moments, which is what's so cool about it. Especially because most recordings you hear, on the Billboard Top 100, they're not really capturing moments in the same way. Things are hyper edited or resampled, and there's something
Right.
beautiful about making music that way too. But you lose a lot of the like. This is an undisturbed moment in time that's being captured that people get to
Mhm.
observe. And as someone, I came out of a lot of like playing a lot of jazz music and a lot of improvised music where things really only happen once, and if you don't capture it, then it's gone forever. And that's sort of like when I listen to a lot of my favorite Blue Note records, like part of what makes, like Unity by Larry Young so cool. It's like you get a window into this like performance that is never going to happen again. It only happens that way one time, and there's something
Yeah.
like very special about that. And I think the Pomplamoose Scary Pocket stuff is really good at that, and it's fun to make music like that, especially because it doesn't happen that much anymore.
Yeah. Well, and you have the added element of video now too, right? Where like
Yeah,
you feel like you're in that session because
yeah,
you can sort of see everyone's reactions to someone playing something just absolutely incredible, right?
yeah,
And
yeah. That's the yeah. So yeah, I forget about that because I'm such like I kind of like I'm kind of a purist in the sense where it's like I don't really like videos are cool, but I mostly care about the music part of it. But it's like, yeah, as like an
yeah.
audience member, it's like it must be cool to be able to see everything, especially because I think like most people don't really know how music actually gets made.
Huh. Yeah.
Like if you're thinking about like the average consumer, like nobody knows, like nobody like you see like a rock band biopic or something, and it's just like one mic in a room, and people are like, is that how records get made? And the answer is like, no, that's not how records get made, especially now. But that is kind of like how the Pomplamoose and Scary Pocket stuff get made. So I think there's
Mhm.
something cool. There aren't a lot of things that are concealed from the listener on those songs. On some of the Pomplamoose stuff, there are overdubs and stuff like that, but they try to show them being recorded a lot of the time, even if they're not in the actual studio. They'll cut away to the things being added. And
Okay.
Pomplamoose
Yeah.
has always done that. Like their old video songs are like that. They have a rule where it's like if you hear it, eventually you see it in the video. And so there's
Yeah.
sort of that like kind of um, that sort of window into the artistic process that I think people who aren't musicians very rarely get to actually see. And you actually
Right.
know what's being performed and what's not, and which is something that like on a pop song you have no idea. And most of the time nothing's really being performed in the same way.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I think, like I've seen the Pomplamoose stuff, the Scary Pocket stuff, but I think the first time that I saw you play was in 2017
Mhm.
on the Christmas Volf Drive.
Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
that, man, that seemed like an absolute like marathon, like wild ride. Like what was
Yeah.
that like doing that gig?
So I've subbed for Joe twice. I did one house party at my college that Wolfpack played, and Joe had some kind of family emergency and had to cancel. Like, hey, he had to go fly home at the last minute.
Yeah.
Uh, and so Theo asked me to like, oh, just come sit in at this house party and play the whole gig. And if I don't know if you, I'm pretty sure Jack talked about this, but they don't rehearse. Like Wolfpack never rehearses.
Right.
So you just have to
Which is
know a bunch of
insane.
their songs. So when I got that text from Theo, the gig was the day before, and I knew I was in a tour rehearsal all day, so I wasn't going to have time to learn any of the music the day of the gig. So I was like, if I don't learn 15 songs right now, I'm not going to be able to do this. So I learned as many of them as fast as possible, and then we went
Yeah.
and did the gig, and it was fun. And then so the second one was a lot like that, where instead of just me doing it, I play in this band called Shrek is Love with
Yeah.
I don't know if you know Christian Newman and Jacob Mann and Michael Mayo, but they're all in the band. And
Yeah.
so on the Wolf Drive, Jack called it like a Wolfpack cover band. That was the joke. And so it was
Okay. Yeah.
me, Corey Wong, Jacob Mann, and Christian Newman.
Yeah.
And because I had done that one other gig, I knew a lot of their songs already.
Mhm.
So you just kind of roll with the punches and try to like, and it's funny, like I do a lot of gigs like that where you just kind of show up and there's no rehearsing and you just kind of figure it out and everyone's aware, and everyone's cue languages are slightly different. So like trying to figure out what
Mm.
jacks are, that's always like the thing. Um, but it was really fun. And it's hard. I mean, like Joe's a friend of mine, and his voice is such a big part of the band. Whenever
Right.
you are in a position where you have to sub for somebody like that, where it's like the
Mm.
bass is like foundational to the way the band sounds, uh, it's hard to. The hardest part um, isn't necessarily learning the music, but trying to figure out like at what point do I stay true to the original arrangements, and at what point do I like add my own thing, especially in a band like that, which is so improvisatory. So that was like the challenging thing. And obviously all their fans want to see Joe there. And we're, you know, it's like having to sub in a position like that is not the easiest thing in the world, because all those cats know every note of the songs, of the bass lines, like, which is abnormal, right? Like most of the time, like if you're something on someone's gigs, it's not like an audience member is going to like know how the bass line goes, really, you know? So there's like a lot of scrutiny in that position, but it was really fun. I had a really great time doing it. Yeah, and that stream was funny. I mean, Jack is hilarious. I mean, all those guys are like some of the funniest people I know. And that stream is no exception. So yeah, that was great. I was actually just talking to Christian, and Jacob came over the other day because we're working on making a bunch of we're working on a trio record that we're going to record at the end of the year. And so we were working on some music, and we were talking about that, because it's now kind of a long time ago, which is a trip. It's like 5 years ago.
Yeah, man. So like, can you talk more to like to those experiences of just kind of showing up at the session, like you know, whether it's, you know, the Vault Drive or Scary Pocket session or Pamplemousse session, where like you said, you're just sort of figuring out the arrangement like that day. Obviously, you know the tune that's being covered, right? But like how does that all sort of come together?
I think the way it works with the Pamplemousse and Scary Pocket stuff is everyone is really everyone in those bands are really active listeners, and they know how to communicate with each other while they play. So anytime you listen to someone play, there's a lot of information that's being communicated in what they do. And if you have enough experience and sharp enough ears, you can interact with them. And part of the way I think those sessions work is like everyone's really used to playing in a lot of live bands and knows a lot about, like Pockets is a great example, right? Like it's a funk band. They do funk versions of songs. So there's like there's a specific kind of vocabulary associated with that, and certain instruments have particular kinds of roles. And so once someone has an idea, everyone else knows enough about the kind of vernacular of funk music and soul music to kind of figure out a way to shape like the initial idea into something that works for the whole ensemble fairly quickly.
Yeah.
And that's something that just comes harmonically, rhythmically, coming up with parts, arrangement things, when to reharm chords. Those are all of the things that get kind of tweaked. Tempos, grooves, feels. Yeah, and something too I think about those kinds of sessions is it can be really, unless you've done a lot of them, it can be, making those kinds of quick decisions can be intimidating.
Sure.
And I think the biggest thing about those ones that make them work is people make really quick decisions and are not afraid to like abandon ideas that aren't working or throw out new things to try to get the song to the best place it can be. Because at the end of the day, it's all about like, how good can we make this recording? Not like, and everyone's really good about thinking compositionally and thinking about the whole band, not just about themselves.
Yeah. I was talking to someone else about something similar the other day, and they were talking about not getting too attached to an idea, right? Like being able to just sort of let that go, make room for something better, right? And just sort of allow yourself to do that.
Yeah, and like there's a tune that I did with Scary Pockets with my friend Michael, where we did like an NSYNC cover, and the whole genesis of it was Rob Humphreys was playing drums and was like, "Wouldn't it be funny if we did NSYNC in 7?" And that was it was a joke, but then we actually started arranging it that way, and it doesn't stay in 7 the whole time. It eventually goes to 4, but that kind of, and Michael is a freak and can like sing an odd like he doesn't struggle with that kind of, he's like one of the best singers I've ever met in my whole life. And so we were just like, let's try it. And he just like made the melody work, and we were like, this is great, let's start with that.
Man, yeah, that's insane.
Yeah. So it all just starts like, and I think we did that tune in like 50 minutes probably.
That's so wild to me. Yeah, just like the fact that you're coming into it just like knowing the original version of the tune, and then you can come out in under an hour with what sounds like a very premeditated arrangement.
Yeah. And I will say too, sometimes like, and again, you have to have enough experience for this to be positive, but having like extreme deadlines like that just force you into positions where you have to make choices really fast. Like if we were doing something like that and I was at home alone during quarantine, it was like, okay, how am I going to finesse this arrangement? It would have taken me way longer. But when you're working collaboratively and you have a deadline that you have to get this done, you just figure, as long as like people have enough experience playing in ensembles, that's really the thing that matters most. Then you can kind of do that, and it's fine, and it's great, and it's actually better than if you had like slaved away at it and tried to distill into this like perfect, clever thing alone. Like you get all of these different people adding their voices to something, and then it just happens because you're in this like pressure cooker environment where it has to be done at a certain like very quick amount of time. And that's why all those Motown records were made like that too,
Yeah.
People would just kind of maybe have a lead sheet or a rough idea, or there'd be a basic song, and they'd be like, well, we have to do like 5 of these today, so we got to get through it. So let's figure out what everyone's going to do.
Yeah.
And also, Jack and Ryan specifically are really great about, because they're in every song, obviously. They have played together so much that they know what their roles are going to be on the ensemble, and it's like pretty set. There's variation, but Jack and Ryan always try to come up with interlocking parts, and because at least that's kind of given, everyone can kind of fit around that.
Exactly.
So so that's another thing that kind of helps. They have a chemistry that's consistent across all the recordings, even though the bass and drums and singers are always changing.
Yeah. So you mentioned like looking for, like you're saying, everyone has their own sort of cues. What are some of like the the cues for like the guys that you work with regularly, or like you mentioned Jack Stratton, like what are some of those guys' cues like?
Yeah, so I mean, everyone has like different little hand signals. That's the thing. So like if you're playing with a singer, like I have some singer friends who will be like that for verse or chorus, and other people will be like top or move on. And some of them people like tend to do, they're pretty common and a lot of people do them. But Jack will like one of the I think I'm remembering this correctly. On the Wolfpack live stream, he made some joke about, he said something that was like, all right, Nick, do something, something, something. And I thought he was asking me to like do a troll solo, but what he wanted me to do was start a groove, and I just didn't know, So it's like there's things like that happen sometimes, but I think the thing about like playing in an ensemble and performing, for me, it's really all about like active listening. So trying to like be like, when I'm in a band or on a stage and playing a song, I think way more about what everyone else is doing than what I'm doing. Even when I'm soloing, I want to interact with what's happening around me. I never feel like isolated. I never want to feel like isolated on stage. I'm always trying to think about what's going on around me, especially as a bass player. It's such a supportive role in an ensemble that's I'm there to be glue. I'm there to be the glue between like the rhythm and the harmony and the melody, and just trying to be aware and see where I can kind of shape the space around me in the best way I can at that moment, and then see how it evolves over time. And a lot of that kind of comes from kind of like a lot of my experiences playing a lot of improvised music, where like the density space of the ensemble is always changing. And there has to be agreement about how that changes between everybody. And it all happens kind of based on cues people give through their playing. So if you're not listening to what people are doing, really, you'll miss a lot of that kind of stuff,
Yes. Yeah.
And even though the Pomplamoose and Pocket stuff isn't really jazz, that active listening part of it is very much part of how that all works.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, like listening is like arguably, one of the most important parts of performing music, right? I always say like you got 2 ears and one mouth, so you speak or you listen twice as much as you speak, right?
Yeah, that's a good adage. I like that.
Yeah.
Um,
So how would you, yeah, go ahead.
sorry, no, you go first.
Okay. So
Yeah.
how how would you describe your like your personal sound?
It's a good question. I mean, I have a lot. I mean, I guess I have a different kind of sound as a sideman that I do as like for like I just finished a record that I'm gonna hopefully put out towards the end of the year of a bunch of songs that I wrote or co-wrote with friends. And I think like my music, I kind of exist somewhere between like a lot of soul music, weird modern jazz, and like Frank Zappa and like a handful of punk bands that I'm obsessed with.
Okay.
So, um, and then as a sideman, I mean, I tend to play. It's especially lately. I've been playing a lot of stuff that's kind of comes out of the R&B and soul tradition. So I definitely kind of have like a neo Motown kind of thing, um, and then a sort of just a lot of experience like with jazz harmony and
Yeah.
playing kind of like really linear sort of things. And then I'm a big fan of like vintage basses and like tube amps and stuff like that. So I tend to have like a pretty warm, sort of vintagey kind of sound. But I tend to find myself playing like sort of more modern harmonic ideas, and then when people let me, I like playing a lot of like fast punk music and blast beats and stuff like that. So I'll try to sneak some of that stuff into things where they don't really belong. I definitely have a tendency to like antagonize the audience, which for better or worse, some people like and some people don't. I try on certain gigs, I dial that way back.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But if I'm allowed to do it, I will. And some people are cool with that, and some are not.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely like like going through your Instagram, sort of like totally see the Zappa influence now.
Mhm.
But like, yeah, just kind of get the kind of playfulness, kind of not like not like meme playing, but like, that kind of you know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like,
totally. I mean, I think if there's anything I get from Zappa, because it's funny. Like, I was listening to I got the masters for my record back a couple months ago, and I didn't realize how much I was borrowing from Zappa in a lot of ways. And
mm,
I saw the Zappa documentary, the new one that came out pretty recently, and I was going back and listening through a lot of my favorite of his records. And I think the thing that I have in common with him primarily is like the sense of humor about music.
yeah,
And a lot of people take their music like really seriously. Like not the craft part of it, like I take the craft part of it really seriously,
of course.
but the part that's associated with like the ego is something people take like way too seriously in my opinion.
Yeah.
And in my personal experiences, I've been around a lot of people, especially like I used to do a lot of touring in the pop world and stuff like that. And especially when you're playing with like some new artists who like are convinced they're going to be superstars, they take themselves so seriously
Like,
that like
yeah.
everything becomes kind of joyless.
Mm,
And I think a lot of, and especially coming out of like music school where there's rules about a lot of stuff, I think like a lot of my contemporaries have like this sort of sense of humor about rules in music that kind of comes out in sort of like quasi meme ways. Um, and if anything, I think there's like a lot of the satire about like musical satire that's showing up in a lot of like the kind of like LA jazz scene has to do with like a satire of orthodoxy. And it's just there's so many funny things about how the music industry works. Like once you see how the sausage is made, it's hard to take it seriously after a while.
sure. Yeah.
Like I've had to do so many weird things. Like I remember doing a bunch of TV shows in Japan and watching people like mime their vocals and stuff like that, or like just stuff that's like, I can't believe this is how this is done. Uh,
Right. Right.
and you just start to have certain experiences that just are just funny. Like you just, I don't know. So I think there's like yeah, I think a lot of it is a reaction probably to that. And it's also, I think there's something about social media too that you get like very propagandized, filtered images of people's life that are curated
Mm,
that they want you to see, that are there to maximize something they're selling you, a lot of the time. And for music,
right.
what people usually want is they want you to pay attention to their music because it's hard to get people to do that. And I think there's certainly some kind of like race to the bottom in terms of like people trying to get each other attention that's like kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so much of a lot of modern music right now is like are sort of like cynical attempts to capture attention that it's like it's hard not to satirize some of that stuff or to take it seriously.
Yeah, well, it's so transparent.
Yeah. So I think that's sort of like a sideways answer probably, but I think that's like a lot of the stuff that when I think something's funny about music, that's probably it's somewhere in that area.
Yeah. So I mean, just to keep going off this, like you got it on your hats, in your hashtags, right? Like what's the story behind Respect My Art?
Yeah, so that's sort of like I mean, if you hang out in a lot of like academic high art circles, and I think like a lot of the jazz scene, especially some of the more like avant-garde stuff, can be categorized that way. There's this sort of kind of like funny ethos about like, oh well, it doesn't matter if it sounds good, it's my art and you have to deal with it. That like there's like a lack of concern for the audience in a lot of that space, in a lot of those spaces. And as someone who likes to antagonize the audiences, I think it's cool to be confrontational towards your audience. But I think a lot of the time I've been in spaces, especially with younger jazz musicians who are like very academically minded, that there's often like a total lack of consideration for the audience. Like they're almost like not even present. And I think that sort of ethos of like, oh man, you got to respect my art. Like I don't know. It's just like a little bit that I think is funny. Like and then that band Oregon Freeman named one of their albums after that hashtag.
Oh, did they really?
They made a hat and they gave it to me. So that's why I have the hat.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool.
But I think that's probably where it comes from. And I mean, like I've definitely played some modern jazz gigs and been to some where it's like the audience gets taken, there's a lot of abuse in terms of just like how intense the music is and how much you have to know to understand what's going on, to even like get in the door. And I think like, taking it back to Wolfpack, like, I mean, I've been to a lot of shows that are like that I love, that are great music, and it's a niche, and it's just hard to get people who aren't, there's not a lot of, it's a complicated thing because it sounds like I'm making fun of the jazz scene, and that's not my intention, because like at the end of the day, it's like some of my favorite music in the world. Even a lot of the like avant-garde stuff. But I think there's in the United States, especially, there's sort of like a lack of awareness about like the kind of deep musical history we have in terms of like the jazz world and the R&B and soul world, and kind of like I think a lot of modern listeners aren't interested in where things come from. And so like a lot of the things that are being referenced at a jazz concert or whatever are inaccessible to the audience. And I think something that like Wolfpack has done really well is you can use humor as a way of like, kind of like a palate cleanser almost, where it's like, it doesn't matter if you don't know where it comes from, because you can be in on the joke and then understand it that way.
Yeah.
Like there's something really powerful about like using humor as a way to like make the audience more comfortable. And then you can actually push their intuitions like really far. And I think like Frank Zappa is a great example of someone like that. I mean, like a lot of his tunes are like avant-garde 20th century classical music, but because he did it in a context that was like kind of funny, the audience, even though they don't know any of the things that he's referencing and the music is really dissonant, they can get in on the joke, and they don't have to know all of the, they don't have to have like looked at the score for the Rite of Spring to like get what's being referenced, right? There's like something that an audience can latch onto. And I think there's something really useful about that, especially for more progressive music, which can, in certain contexts, be like very stale and unfun.
Yeah.
Even if it's like very impressive. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's, because I'm trying to think of the like people are going to respect the sort of avant-garde stuff because of the challenge that it presents, right?
Mhm.
But at the same time, you're right. Like it has to, no matter what, it still has to be accessible in some sort of way.
Yeah, I just think like, and even if it's inaccessible, you want to like think about. I try to think about like, because I write a lot. I feel like I write a lot of inaccessible music, and I try to at least think about what it must feel like to be an audience member for it.
Yeah.
Even if I didn't actively decide to antagonize them or do something that makes them uncomfortable, I still try to think about what it would be like to be a listener
Mm.
for the thing. You know what I mean? And I've definitely been in some spaces, especially in music school. And the older I get, the more I play with like more, experienced musicians in the improvised music world. Like more people are like that. I'm not trying to say that like everyone's like this, but there's certainly like a specific music school ethos that like doesn't consider the audience at all, really.
Mm.
And and maybe it's because I've always felt like I'm in between scenes. Like I'm an improvising musician who like plays a lot of pop music and have done pop tours, and I've spent a lot of time with people who can't stand jazz or can't stand avant-garde music or progressive music. Um, and I think a lot of what they tend to react to isn't so much the music itself, but it's the ethos around the music. And sometimes I've been in positions where if I can present certain music in a way that's more fun to people who wouldn't normally like it, they'll end up being on board. So I think probably that's why, like, I've ended up starting to like think about that, at least for the stuff that I write.
Yeah. Yeah. So like how do your like your influences kind of shape who you are as an artist, like right now, like in this moment?
Oh man, that's a hard question to answer. I think, I think in terms like most, let me think about this. I think in my experience, my influences in terms of like thinking about my musical development, I think I probably copied a lot of my influences pretty directly. And then at a certain point, I had enough different influences that I was copying that I was able to kind of like find my own voice inside of that.
Mm.
Um, and so like some of my favorite uh, bass players, like, I'm a huge Tim LaFave fan. I love Pino. I love Jocko, Paul Jackson, Jamerson,
Mhm.
Colin Greenwood from Radiohead, Justin Mel Johnson. Like they're all and a lot of them are really different from each other. And so there's little things. Rocco Prestia is a big one. Um, there's so many. Ray Brown, Paul Chambers, uh, Larry Grenadier. They're all totally different. And I think I've picked up over I've been playing bass now for 16 years. So I think I've picked little things out from all of these different people that I like. And then eventually you kind of get this amalgam where it's like, well, now I don't really sound like any of them. I kind of have, I think I figured out a way to like sound like myself a little more. And then once
Right.
you find that thing that you're like, that's what I sound like, and you don't cringe at it, because that's like the first, at least that was my first instinct. Uh, you can develop it, and then it becomes more things. Um, and I think for me, I didn't really get a glimmer of. I started to kind of get glimmers of my own musical identity maybe when I was like 22, 23, and then started
Mhm.
to develop it further. Because like when I listened to myself on older recording, and because I was young and hadn't been playing for very long, I don't really recognize myself like before that age on recordings.
Hmm.
It's not until then where I start to be like, that's what I can hear myself. And then it just over time got more and more uh, kind of distinct. And I think I'm still working on it. I think everyone is working on that forever. But
Oh, of
that's
course.
kind of what it was like for me, I think.
Yeah. So how important are influential artists?
I think really important. I don't think anybody learned like everybody who I think becomes a musician like has like a moment in their adolescence where like they fall in love with music. Um, and there's no point in being the music industry is so brutal. There's no point in doing it if you haven't had that experience. Like you're just gonna have a miserable time.
Mm.
You have to have that drive to like it. Like for me at least, I'm in the music industry because I want to be playing music all the time, and the only way to do that is to do it professionally. like the business part of the music industry is all terrible. There's very little good, there are very few good things about it, other than you get to spend all your time playing music, which is the best thing in the world, and that is like a non-negotiable for me.
Yeah.
So in that respect, I think it's super important. And then also, nobody creates anything in a vacuum, right? Everything references something. So, and I'm a big fan. I mean, I spend a lot of time listening to a lot of older music, and I like to know. I mean, there's certainly people who are much more encyclopedic about this than I am. There are really people who are like scholars of the American music tradition, and I don't consider myself that exactly, but I think I know enough to kind of have a through line between a bunch of different things I can reference, and I think they all kind of contribute to the way I think about harmony or arrangements or sound design. And it all has to, I mean, music is like a language, so it has to be intelligible, and for it to be intelligible, it has to reference things that already exist,
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, at least that's how I think about it.
Yeah. So to kind of like pivot back to, I guess, some social media stuff. I mean, you're pretty active on Instagram. And I mean, you like caption and describe a lot of stuff, like a lot of what you post as like content.
Yeah.
Like you call your content.
Yeah.
What's your outlook on social media for like for artists and putting out or pumping out content?
I have a fairly negative view about it at the moment. It's funny you bring that up, because I'm actually, one of the projects I've been working on with a friend of mine. I'm researching right now a book about market failures in the music industry, and I think the internet has been a complicating thing for the music industry, and there have been a lot of benefits, but there have been a lot of downsides. And when it comes to the social media part of it specifically, I think we now live in a time, because music kind of follows a leasing model. Nobody buys it anymore. It's not something that, like, when you bought records,
right.
And I buy records, like I like listening to music on vinyl. I don't do it all the time, but there's something about when you put a record on, it focuses your experience, and that's what you're doing. And because of that, I think it sort of elevated the art form a bit to something that sort of has this like all-encompassing feeling where you can, I mean, music can be many things, right? It can be entertainment, it can be catharsis, it can be an intellectual exercises, and an intellectual exercise. It can be wallpaper, which is mostly what it is today in terms of like minutes listened. Like you walk into a store and there's music playing, you don't pay attention to it, right? Like that's most of people's experience listening to music. And I think that the internet, while it's been really good for some people to get their stuff out there, I think there's a big pressure to release things constantly, and certain kinds of music, especially kinds of music that require a lot of thought and arrangement in advance, can't be put out at the pace that you need to keep people's attention on social media platforms. And that does a disservice to the art form in general, in some ways. There are certain people who have figured out how to do both. Like have it both ways. Like I think like Pomplamoose and Scary Pockets are great examples of bands that put out regular releases at a really high level. And, but it's really hard to do that with like original music all the time.
Sure,
Pomplamoose has a lot of original songs, but, and Natalie is like one of my favorite songwriters that I know. But I think like the breakneck pace that you have to do it, to me, creates like an actual like non-semantic distinction between the stuff that gets put out as content and the stuff that really gets put out with like as capital A art, and they really are not the same. And there, I think, is something for me as like a lover of musical art and the performing arts. There is something lost in the content part of it. I find it a lot less engaging. And a lot of the way I've been, because I'm a fairly introverted guy. I don't really like being on the internet or responding to things. Like I find I get a lot of anxiety from it. I've been more, but it's something you have to do. You, as a musician, or someone in the arts, success is socially mediated. And if you're not part of the social networks, then people don't think about you for things. So you have to be present. You have to do something. You can't just abstain unless you're already like successful. Like some people are able to do that. But if you're trying to build something, you have to be on the internet. It's like not really an option.
Yeah.
So what I've been the only way I've been able to make it work for me, at least on Instagram, is I just try to like, I'll write a minute of music and put it out and see how people react to it and see if I like it later. And the stuff that I like turns into songs later. So it's almost like us writing in public sort of thing.
Yeah.
And maybe it's just because I like postmodern art, that drawing attention to the fact that that's what's happening. I think it's funny, but it's also like, you know, I find social media so unpleasant that if I don't draw attention to it, to how ridiculous it is, I don't really want to be a part of it, but I don't really have the choice to not be a part of it. So I have to find some way of like making fun of it a little bit, because otherwise I can't really stand it, you know? Yeah. Other people who are oriented differently probably have like very different feelings about the internet. I mean, there are great things about it too. I'm just focusing on some of the negatives right now, but the direct fan interaction is really cool. I mean, I do a lot of Q&As on my Instagram, and people ask me really great questions, and I really like talking to people that way. It's cool, especially someone who like usually, you know, when the gig's over, I'm going home immediately. Like I don't hang out. Like I'm a pretty shy dude. That's cool. Like there are things about it that are really great. But I do think that the kind of, you know, there's a big difference between my favorite records and my favorite internet content. And the difference is not trivial, you know? So I do try to make a distinction between the two. And I think it's just really hard to get people to pay attention to works of art that require focus right now. And there are people who have used those constraints in really cool ways. I'm not sure if I'm one of them. I'm not sure if I know how to do that, though. And I'm learning, and you know, the music industry right now is kind of in a new place. So it's hard to see what the equilibrium for that will be. And it's hard to know what music really means to people right now. You know, it does seem like the entertainment part of music is the part that's most dominant, which is cool. And there's a lot of entertaining music that's really great. And so I'm not trying to knock that or make a value judgment in any way. But one of my favorite, that's not the only thing I like about music, and trying to find the space for sort of like, kind of like more nuanced statements through music is something that I don't see a lot on the internet right now. There's some, but I feel like it's a little underrepresented. And I think the race to the bottom in the content wars is probably part of the reason for that. There's just so much competition for attention.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's always positive.
Yeah. So, you know, you said, like, obviously, like now you have to be active on social media. But how, I'm assuming you sort of got partnered up with Scary Pockets and Pamplemousse sort of before it became as important, right? So, or is that incorrect?
Well, I would say socially it was important probably already. I just wasn't engaging with it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I would just make that distinction. I mean, a lot of the Pamplemousse and Scary Pockets crew is all we all went, a lot of us went to the same college, which is how we knew each other. So I met Ryan at a jam session when I was in college with like my friend Remy LaBeouf and like Lewis Cole and a couple other people. And then I ran into him again after not seeing him in a while at the Wolfpack Drive, and Sam was on tour and couldn't do a Scary Pocket session, so he asked me to sub. And then we did a lot of really cool tunes that day. And then Pamplemousse needed a sub, so Jack was like, "Oh, I just played with this guy Nick, so we should call him for it." And so that's how I met all those guys. And Sam and I went to college together too, actually. We were at the same year at USC. And so we used to practice together for juries. And we still sub gigs out to each other all the time. But I have like a really long history with all of the people in that crew, or a lot of them at least. So that all happened like sans internet. Like the social networks online are not the only social networks that matter in the music industry, but they are important. And especially in the last year where there's been no live performance, where a lot of social networking happens between artists, it was the only outlet for a while. And that's thankfully starting to change a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I struggle with like how to be online. And I think a lot of people do. It's hard. Some people are really great at it and are like true savants when it comes to, I've never met a better person on the internet than Jack Stratton. I mean, he's like a genius when it comes to that. So it also helps that he's an incredible musician, but I mean, the internet is one of his instruments for sure. I don't feel like I've ever had anything like that. It's always sort of been like I've always had kind of a complicated relationship with it. So
yeah. So that community of musicians that you studied with is clearly like incredibly important.
Yeah. I mean, that was like being able to meet all those people was definitely life changing in terms of like my own growth as an artist and professional opportunities, and also there's just all those guys are my closest friends. I mean, I don't have a lot of non-musician friends, mostly because if I didn't have to go to gigs, I wouldn't be socializing. So I'm like introverted enough that it's like I just probably would never leave my house, So I'm thankful to be part of a social art form where I like actually meet. I think it's helped like chill me out a little bit.
But I think musicians naturally gravitate to other musicians.
Yeah, I mean, and it kind of goes back to what we were saying at the beginning of this conversation about communication through music. Like a lot of my close friends, the first time we met, we're on a gig or a rehearsal, and like the second you play with somebody and there's a connection, you're kind of already friends. You get to skip a lot of the like social games around meeting people for the first time and getting to know somebody. Like when you play with them, you kind of know them afterwards, even if you've never spoken before,
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of practice to get to the place where you can actually do that. But I had a lot of social anxiety problems when I was younger, and like figuring out how to do that was like a really big deal for me in terms of like dealing with it. And even now when I go out to gigs, like, man, I went to a friend's gig to sit in the other week, and there was a lot of people in the room, and I started to get really anxious. I hadn't been in, there was so much stimulus. I like didn't know how to deal with it, and it kind of reminded me of like being a kid and feeling like that. It's been a very strange year for all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because you sort of lose that practice of performing in front of other people, because that's its own form of practice. In itself, right? Is getting used to, doing that performance,
Yeah. So yeah, but I forgot what the original question was. I think we've gone a lot of different places. I was about to say a thing, and then I was like, I'm not sure if the last three things I said are connected to each other in any way, or at least not connected to the first thing.
Yeah, it's all good. We're just talking about community,
Cool. Yeah. No, I mean that's being I'm happy that the art form I fell in love with is a social one. I think that was probably a good thing for me.
Yeah.
Because not all things are like that. I mean, like even working on this book and doing the research, I'm doing it with a partner, so at least we can talk to each other, but it's all solitary. And even parts of music are really solitary. Like I know people who are producers who spend a lot of time alone in a room. And I've never, it's not that I've never liked, I do arrangements and productions and stuff like that, but that's definitely not my favorite part of music. It's like the work that you have to do to create something, but it's not the thing that I like.
Yeah.
Like I want that moment being captured of real performance. That's like the thing. I think if I have anything to contribute to the art form, it's in that area.
Yeah. So I've got a really close friend who would, who would kill me if I don't ask you this question.
Sure.
Do you, have you been working with Lewis Cole at all? You mentioned his name.
I haven't really. Lewis is a friend of mine. I haven't seen him in a while. I've done a few gigs with him, but I haven't played on any of his records or done any tours with Noah or anything like that. But we've done a few gigs together. I remember Jacob Mann and I and Lewis were all talking about doing a house party show at my house before COVID, and then COVID happened and it didn't happen. But
Yeah.
I think the last time I went over to Lewis's place probably 4 months before COVID, and we played some tunes, which was really fun. And he is an amazing musician and a very, very cool guy.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what do you have coming up, and where can people find what you're doing?
Sure. Yeah. So coming up, I have a record coming out. I just got the album art back from it, and I'm really happy with it. I made the photographer, my buddy Eric, who took the photos, made an infinite art void in my face, which is awesome. So that'll be coming out soon. I got a lot of friends on it, like Nigel Hall sings a tune, Theo and Antoine are on it. Raquel's on it. Like a bunch of people I've been making music with for a really long time are all on it.
Yeah.
So I feel really good about that. I'm kind of bored of it because I've been working on it for so long, but all my friends' performances are so good that I'm like still excited about it.
Yeah.
So that'll hopefully come out soon. So that's definitely the big thing to keep an eye out for.
Cool.
And then as gigs start to get back, hopefully I'll be traveling a lot in the next year or so. I got some festival gigs with some friends, kind of on the horizon. And then the trio record I'm working on with Christian Newman and Jacob Mann, I think it's going to be really good. I'm excited about that. Those are the big main musical things.
Awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll have links in the video description to your stuff, so people can
great.
check out what you do.
Yeah, dude. Nick Campbell Destroys, full branding.
Yeah.
I've submitted to the algorithm, you know.
Well, thanks for coming on today, man. It was great.
Of course, man. Thanks for having me, man. Such a pleasure to hang for a sec.
Yeah. All right. We'll talk to you soon.
All right, man. I'll catch you later.